Welcome to the Harmonist Connection. We are going to have our third Harmonist Connection presentation. This is when all three sites get to come together. All three Harmonist sites get to come together and learn a little bit more about Harmonist history in some way. We have Michael Lewis with us tonight, and he is a professor of art at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. He is also really busy and always on the road because he is the architecture critic for the Wall Street Journal. So we are lucky to have him tonight. So I am not going to say much more about him, although I do want to plug his book. The City of Refuge is his book about utopian communities, and it was published in 2016. So you could pick up your copy. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Michael Lewis. And at the end, we're going to have questions. So go ahead, Michael. You are muted.
Great. I was muted. Yes. Thank you. Well, welcome, everybody. It's nice to see a lot of friends there, old friends and new. I'm going to go right to share screen, and I am going to bring up the PowerPoint, which always takes a second. Slideshow. Slideshow is blocked by Susan Webb trying to enter. Okay. All right. I want to tell you that most books begin with biography. Something catches your attention, intrigues you, perplexes you, and sometimes it takes a long time for that to come to full fruition. Over 35 years ago, I was living in Germany, graduate student, and I went with a friend of mine to a youth gathering at the Moravian settlement at a place near Frankfurt called Herrenhaag. There's a slide I took in 1986. And I spent a week performing volunteer work on the restoration of this curious building. I say curious because of its inhibited nature. It seems to yearn to be Baroque, but it just won't let itself go. The roof is all pomp and circumstance, but the walls below are all sobriety and simplicity. And it's got 10 axes, vertical rows of windows, an even number, so there can't be a central opening that you can make ostentatious. And if there's one thing the Moravians did not approve of, it was ostentation, especially here, because this was the residence and meeting house of Count Zinzendorf, the Saxon nobleman who revived the modern Moravian church in 1727. The original Moravians, you might know, were the followers of Jan Hus, who were savagely suppressed following his execution 3 centuries earlier. And since that time, they lived an underground, furtive existence in Moravia, today the eastern part of the Czech Republic. And they can be regarded as the first Protestants. In the 1720s, Count Zinzendorf offered these refugees asylum on his estate. And for this generosity, he was punished. He was soon exiled from Saxony and needed his own sanctuary, hence the creation of Herrenhaag, which flourished only for a dozen years, as you can see, before it too was suppressed. And over the centuries, it would crumble. Today, only 2 buildings are left. On the left is the dormitory for single women, and on the right, the Zinzendorf house. It has been cruelly battered, but the architect's drawings survive, and they reveal as sheer a piece of virtuosity as you will find. Look how the public and the private space in the plan interlock, and look at along generous paths of public movement. And look also at the spacing of the windows and the dormers in the roof. This is not the tick-tock of a metronome, but a pleasantly variable rhythm, alternately halting and quickening. This is an architect in absolute control, in control of space, construction, and image. It even had indoor toilets, a luxury in 1744. The White House didn't have them till the 1840s, a century later. But all this I didn't know. I learned it much later. This was my callow youth when I was interested only in Victorian Gothic architecture. I was a bore on that subject and useless on any other. I was a graduate student. So I worked for a week in the building with no great diligence, alas, and that was that. I forgot it. But you shouldn't, because if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have written the book that Sarah held up a few minutes earlier, City of Refuge. But coincidentally, a year later, I went to work on another German settlement of religious dissenters, the town of Economy, just downriver from Pittsburgh, which you all know, I don't need to say that. I was then working for Clio Group, a Philadelphia-based restoration firm, which had just been commissioned to write a survey of the town of Pennsylvania Historical Site. And as most of you know, Economy was the home of the Harmonist Society, the millennial sect founded by George Rapp, a radical pietist preacher who began life as a linen weaver in Swabia. He must have been a man of exceptional personal charisma. We have two images of him. Unfortunately, they are completely different. From an early age, Rapp was tormented, as he put it, quote, by religious thoughts. Soon he was dispensing an entirely original theology that he decanted out of German pietism, mysticism, and millenarianism. And much of it was incendiary, such as his notion that before the fall, mankind was bisexual, that Adam and Eve were the miserable halves of a once complete being who struggled pathetically to reunite themselves after the fall through the animal act of sexual congress, as he put it. No wonder they drove him out of Germany. And he arrived in 1803 in Pennsylvania, along with some 1,000 of his followers. This was the Harmony Society. And over the next quarter of a century, they would prosper and found 3 successive and increasingly rich towns, of which Economy was the last, which he created between 1824 and 1831. Rapp built furiously, without pause, creating settlements that were virtual recreations of Swabian towns, with all their associated buildings, the whole infrastructure. I only can offer you a small selection, but some of them were straightforward replications of German building types plucked right out of the German landscape, such as the granary. Now, grain storage demanded a specialized building. It had to be tall and narrow, with a stone base for stability, but upper stories of timber for cross ventilation and for dryness, and always oriented north-south to minimize the heat of the sun. The Harmonist would build 6 of these, any one of which might have come from the pages of a German manual of farm architecture, like this one, Borheck's Landbaukunst nach deren ökonomischen Grundsätzen, rural architecture according to its economic principles. But some of the buildings only looked like German originals. For example, the church in Economy. Now, here was a brick nave measuring 90 by 60 feet, oriented to the east, which meant the entrance tower was at the west, marked by a bold tower. This is from 1828, which is a rather late date for that Baroque cupola on top. But there was a purpose to the anachronism, because Rapp was reaching back more than a century to the churches around Maulbronn that he knew from his childhood, with their towers that are distinct from the volume of the nave, that rise from a square base to a polygonal, and in this case, octagonal cupola above, which swings between convex and concave. And the church in Economy is as close as can be to its prototypes around Maulbronn. So we can think of Rapp's church as a kind of architectural security blanket that is a comforting transitional object for a dislocated population suffering from what psychologists call separation anxiety. But appearances can be misleading. because these Lutheran churches had their entrance to the west and a pulpit at the opposite end to the east, but not at economy. Look at these studies for the church prepared by Rapp's carpenter builders. They had no chancel over here to the east where you'd expect it. Nah, Rapp instead preached from a chair in the middle of the north side, here or here, depending which one they would have built. The entrance instead was to the south, as in a Puritan meeting house. So in effect, Rapp inserted the body of a Puritan meeting house into the shell of a Lutheran church. And we find this same droll minuet between image and reality in Rapp's own house, which is his version of an Anglo-Palladian house with a main block flanked by lower dependencies, as they're called. Clearly, Rapp wanted to live as a prosperous American merchant, although a merchant of about half a century earlier. Now, apart from the jerkin-head gables, these sawn-off gables that are truncated at the tips, apart from those jerkin heads, which are a German grace note, this is a thoroughly conventional Palladian performance. But its planning, the layout of the interior, was anything but conventional, because once again, the image predicts a certain type of plan. You would expect a formal central hall leading from that central entrance around which the principal rooms are organized, but no such thing. In fact, as you entered, you found that the principal axis was this monumental cross axis of 8 openings leading you through 9 spaces, arranged tightly to create a theatrical vista that in French planning, this processional suite of rooms is called an enfilade. And this is a formal device of display that you know from a palace. And if you've gone into the Rapp house, you see it serves the same purpose to create a processional hierarchy as in a palace of display. And in a sense, that's what the Rapp house was. So it tells us that Rapp's builders and his stepson, Friedrich Rapp, his adopted son, who was his main architect, even after 2 years of practice and experimentation in the United States, they could not shake off Baroque habits of mind. And I think for an itinerant weaver moving around as a journeyman he would have through Swabia, he must have spent a great time admiring the Baroque cultural landscape, because behind his house, he built an elaborate courtly garden segmented into 4 quadrants: orchard, vineyard, flower garden, and a small forest or wilderness, with 2 pavilions of feverishly contrasting character. In the center, an elegant Tempietto with a statue of Harmony carved by the famous American sculptor William Rush in Philadelphia. But in the wilderness quarter, a brazenly crude hut built of boulders, bark, and thatch. Of course, both buildings came from the same source, the courtly gardens of the late 18th century. And especially influential for these building types was a journal, Groman's Magazine for Garden Lovers, as it was called, which was especially fond of this type of building, which the Germans call an Einsiedelei, and we would call a hermitage, the first cabin that hermits would build in the wilderness. Now, as Rapp used it, it evoked his own journey into the American frontier. But besides his physical journey, it evoked a pilgrimage of a more serious sort, because the visitor who was not discouraged by this rustic, rather foreboding heap of boulders, who was brave enough to open its bark doors, would be startled, stupefied by a space of surpassing loveliness. And of course, Rapp tells you this is our journey through life. At first glance, the true path of righteousness looks unpromising, even off-putting, austere, but those who will persevere will find paradise. Now, for the Harmony Society, this crude hut was a physical manifestation of their own travels, immigration, rendered visible in easily understandable didactic symbols, which summed up their arduous wanderings, physical and spiritual, and exhorting them constantly to persist. Now, this is not the symbolism of the late Baroque court, but rather that of German mysticism. And Rapp evidently took it intact from a 1623 mystic book by John Amos Comenius, the Moravian leader and educational reformer. And the book was entitled The Labyrinth, I'll translate it, The Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart. Cumbersome title, which describes the peregrinations of a pilgrim for whom the entire world, the earthly world, is a bewildering, baffling labyrinth. And Rapp seized on the idea of the labyrinth, building one in each of his 3 towns. And the original designs survive. We have all 3 of them. We should rebuild them, or one of them. Well, I guess there have been recreations. Rapp liked to use these as a performance space. He would tease his visitors, inviting them into the labyrinth, and then mysteriously disappear, only to slip through a hidden side passage and then emerge triumphantly from the central pavilion. Even the youngest child would grasp the message: to find paradise, follow Rapp. All this was the imaginative concoction of Rapp, a confection of 17th century mysticism, 18th century garden design. But while he was doing this, he wasn't only looking backwards. At the exact same moment, he could build a dazzlingly modern textile mill, powered by a steam engine, one half devoted to cotton, the other side devoted to wool. All of its clanking energy soothed by that enormous, spreading, sheltering Baroque roof. Although the windows below have lost that one Baroque essential, a happy sense of interval, very utilitarian, if you look at it. This then was the architecture of the Harmony Society, a strange and rather nervous précis of all that George Rapp had ever seen or desired: German vernacular building practices, reminiscences of Baroque gardens, proud federal townhouses, along with a progressive textile mill running on steam. Motives and means jumble together here happily: selective borrowing, cultural inertia, mysticism, but modern industry, balanced so that each move forward towards temporary technology was matched by a step backwards to a nostalgic object offering cultural reassurance. But I mentioned a coincidence at the beginning, and that was this building, the so-called Feast Hall of Economy, Rapp's great building of public assembly. It is a study in restraint, and its plain exterior gives no hint whatsoever that almost the entire second story and roof is taken up with one vast and uninterrupted sweep of space which runs the whole length of the building. Was there once a balcony over here from which Rapp once held forth? If so, he only did it once. The acoustics are catastrophic. I know. Instantly, when I first walked in there, I found myself thinking about Zinzendorf's house in Herrenhaag. It too boasted a second-story meeting room capped by an elliptical vault. It too had segmental windows with deeply splayed jambs, the same slender pillars between them, the same note of simplicity and openness, the same suppression of any sense of an architectural focal point, which stressed not the preacher, but the communal feeling of togetherness, community. And we're fortunate to have the architectural drawing of each building. So to achieve this uninterrupted space, both the Moravians and the Harmonists flaunted an elaborate roof truss. Rising up into that 2-stage roof, you might call it a gambrel roof, which in both cases is precisely 1/2 the height of the building that it surmounts. Now, was I wrong to connect Rapp's building in economy to a Moravian meeting house of a century earlier? As it happened, Zinzendorf's own grandson made the same observation in 1831. This was Louis David Schweinitz, the celebrated botanist. And it was this comparison, in a sense, which launched my book, City of Refuge. How is it that these buildings that stand 80 years apart, 4,000 miles separate, how is it that they came to an architectural solution so similar when the societies they served were so different? Count Nicholas Zinzendorf was a highly cultured aristocrat, a member of the Saxon court in Dresden. He studied at Wittenberg, like Hamlet. He also had a law degree. His godfather was Philip Jakob Spener, the founder of Pietism, and Zinzendorf imbibed its attitudes, the ideal of Pietism, that is an intensely personal faith, a suspicion of church-state entanglement, and a dislike of showy architecture. Zinzendorf embraced all these ideas when he established the modern Moravian Church in 1727. He could scarcely have less resembled Rapp, that autodidact with no higher education, self-taught, and who, despite nearly half a century in the United States, never learned to speak English. And yet both were great makers of towns. Rapp built 3, Harmony, Western Pennsylvania, New Harmony, Indiana, their most famous settlement, and Economy. But Zinzendorf built also proudly and unceasingly. Many were in Europe, but the Moravians also gave us Salem, North Carolina, quite a number of Pennsylvania towns. You know them, Bethlehem, and that delightfully evocative biblical trio of Ephrata, Lidditz, and Emmaus. And every one of these towns, like those of the Harmonists that followed them, was an emblem of divine order. That is, they achieved what the 122nd Psalm says about Jerusalem, quote, a city of compact gridded unity. It becomes clear that this was not a case of one religious body imitating another, because the economists did not set out merely to replicate Moravian settlements. It is that both were drawing upon a shared common tradition. But what exactly is that tradition? And when I began my research in the 80s, this book took a long time for me to write. I got a grant to write it in 2000. I got another one in 2008. I was worried that my tombstone would say, he still owes us a book. So it wasn't until 2016 that I finally wrote it. But the first thing I did, I began to look at what the literature said about utopia. And I began with Lewis Mumford's classic Story of Utopias with its wistful cover. I love it. A ship sails towards the shimmering towers of utopia, never to arrive. And in reading it, there I was to find that there was, quote, a gap. Wait, where's the quote? A gap in the Moravian literature, in the utopian tradition from the 17th century to the 19th. Now, this is a remarkable statement to say there's nothing there. A gap in the utopian tradition, a gap as in an empty space. Well, if the Moravian towns are not in the utopian tradition, what are they? And what about the German towns designed to recruit the Huguenots driven by Louis XIV out of France in 1685, such as Onolzbach? German princes coveted these Huguenot refugees because of their famous industriousness. And this Bavarian town conveyed a sense of tidy efficiency. Look how the regular plan is reflected by the regular architecture. The houses diminishing 1, 2, 3 in 3 regular stages as they recede outwards from the central square. Here are all the elements of Thomas More's utopia, which also called for a city divided into 4 equal parts or quarters, uniform houses, uniform streets. But there are others. What about Freudenstadt, this jubilee of right angles? And another exercise in refugee recruitment, this time to lure Protestant copper and silver workers from Catholic Austria back over to Württemberg. The truth is, there are a great many of these towns, built and unbuilt. They are the way stations in a long and unbroken lineage of ideal towns made by religious separatists and refugees, and invariably quadratic in form. It reaches all the way back to a visionary design made by Albrecht Dürer in 1727, which might be called the first ideal Protestant city, and continues without interruption through the 17th, 18th, and even into the 19th century, where it leapt from religious to secular town and planning. So with apologies to Lewis Mumford, there is no gap in the utopian tradition. There is a gap in the utopian literature. These towns were not unknown. They had been studied by, among others, Hanno Walter Kruft, important German theorist who wrote intelligently about them. But they were always folded into the main story of utopia, the imaginary perfect society described by Thomas More in 1516, more than half a millennium ago. And we should remind ourselves what More did. There have always been notions of a perfect society, mythical, philosophical, theological, or merely administrative. Perhaps every culture has one, a perfect state. But More's book made it possible for the first time to speak collectively of all these notions of perfection with his brilliant new word, the sonorous and immensely suggestive utopian, that Latin pun that subsumed Latin pun, which is perfect place and no place. He subsumed all these different conceptions of human perfection, Greek and Roman, Jewish and Christian, into a single irresistible vision. And this vision has become a potent force in our Western culture, where radical campaigns for social reform soon came to arouse the kind of rapturous millennial hopes once restricted to heavenly paradise. What promise is there in names like the City of the Sun or the New Atlantis? And a good portion of Western history during the past 5 centuries has been the story of utopian revolutions and their consequences. But this is the mainstream of utopian thought. That is to achieve a perfect world society. But there is a second parallel lineage, an alternative utopian lineage, which has been neglected precisely because it did not do what we expect of utopian projects. It did not seek to transform and perfect the world, but to flee from it. Its creators did not wish to perfect a corrupt world, but recognized the impossibility of its perfection, instead sought to create a sanctuary from it. As here, at the other end of Pennsylvania, Conrad Beissel's cloistered settlement at Ephrata. These sanctuary cities, if I can be anachronistic, are a phenomenon of the wars of religion that followed the Protestant Reformation. For 2 centuries, the roads of Europe were crammed with refugees, whole populations drawing carts or lugging packs, all in search of asylums. When the religious wars finally ended and Europe sank into exhaustion, panting, the religious map of Central Europe was a crazy quilt of principalities, alternately Lutheran, Catholic, or Calvinist, each containing a sizable minority of dissenters who were periodically expelled or persecuted to the point of self-exile. This was the stern doctrine of cuius regio, oius religio, whose realm, his religion, which imposed the faith of the relevant prince or duke on his people, which gave the dissenter but 2 choices, conform or flee. Now, in some instances, as with George Rapp, refugees were able to build their own towns. In others, the ruling hosts built towns for them to lure them there. But in either case, these cities of refuge, as I call them, differ strikingly from the imaginary ideal cities of the Italian Renaissance with their ideal formal squares and their centralizing plans. as here in Sforzinda on the bottom, Filarette's architectural fantasy with its abstract Platonic geometry. Yet the city of refuge was not an ideal abstraction. It could not afford to be. It had an urgent necessity. You couldn't simply imagine it. You had to build it with real materials on a real site in real time and in a real climate. For example, this Moravian project, quote, for a town in North Carolina with 136 building lots, was annotated copiously into the smallest detail, including a recommendation that the whole plan be canted 45-degree angles to avoid the blazing midday sun. Or take this plan for the town of Lidditz by the same surveyor. The order geometry here had a darker logic. It was designed in 1758, 3 years after the Gnadenhutten massacre, where 11 Moravians were killed by Indians. And so it was designed that the houses stood shoulder to shoulder so as to form a defensive perimeter if needed, to form a protective wall. Each of these I call a city of refuge. And the term itself is plucked right out of the Bible. Book of Numbers, which you may remember from Sunday school or Hebrew school, or perhaps not. In chapter 35, we read that Moses was commanded by God to establish 6 cities of refuge. Later in the book of Joshua, we learn their names: Kadesh, Shechem, Hebron on the east side of the Jordan, and Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan on the west. Now, if you plot these cities on a map of ancient Israel, you will discover they are spaced with remarkable evenness, according not to size or population, but according to geography. In other words, reducing as much as possible the longest flight of a fugitive. A refuge needs to be close at hand. The term was revived in 1420 during the Hussite Wars. Those wars were uncommonly savage. After all, Jan Hus himself was granted a safe conduct pass and then was burned anyway at the stake. So who could trust any promises made during negotiations? There came about a spasm of millennial fervor, and the followers of Hus were urged to make their way to a designated city of refuge, evenly distributed like those of ancient Israel, which alone would be spared the destruction that God was about to visit on the earth. And so the idea of the city of refuge is intimately and integrally connected to the very origins of Protestantism. Now, when scientists designate something as a previously unrecognized species, as I propose this is, they're obligated, they call it a type specimen, they are obligated to describe its characteristic features, which distinguish it from similar species and distinguish it from others. And the great distinctive feature of the city of refuge is its imperative squareness. They are almost always square. Not square not only in outline, but in their component parts, squares within squares. The square is the irreducible minimum of their genetic matter, so to speak. And here again, the origin is in the Bible, because on 4 occasions, the Bible describes a perfect city or settlement, and in every case, it is a square. Of course, the ultimate square city is the New Jerusalem, described both by John of Patmos and by the prophet Ezekiel as a 12-gated walled square. Here we have it in a charming 11th century illumination by Facundus Beatus. And I like the way the angel here has a measuring rod to test the squareness of the right angles. Likewise, the cities in the book of Numbers, the cities of the Levites, were similarly square. These are those 48 cities, along with their suburbs, that is their pasturage and common ground, that God commanded Moses to give to the Levites. And once again, Numbers mandated a standard form for these cities, a square measuring 1,000 cubits to a side. Now, if we take a cubit to be about 18 inches, that would give you a city precisely 1,500 feet to a side. And this was just what was done here in an unpublished treatise of 1761 by the Moravian architect Christian Gottlob Reuter. We just earlier saw his plan for Lidditz. So he reconstructs the city of the Levites, and the archetype of all biblical settlements, the encampment of the 12 tribes of Israel during their wanderings through the desert, was likewise a square. Here it is in a famous reconstruction made about 1646 by the rabbi of Amsterdam, Rabbi Jacob Judah Leon. Now, each of these communities, whether inspired by a divine division or else the result of a direct revelation to Moses, can be said to have been sanctioned by God. So anybody opening the Bible looking for guidance on how to build a perfect community must come perforce to the conclusion that a godly city will be square. And all these models have been imitated in various ways. New Jerusalem, for example, was the model for the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith when he sketched his city of Zion in 1833. Smith made his city precisely 1 mile square so he could fit the square mile grid system established by the Continental Congress in 1785. And this would be the model for all subsequent Mormon towns. And then the encampment of the tribes of Israel also had divine sanction, and it had the tragic symbolism of Exodus, a religious people in exile, dislodged from their homeland. But it was a maddeningly difficult model to follow because 12 tribes don't align themselves into a tidy grid. It would have been easier if there'd been 9 tribes or 16, but we had 12. The Moravians solved the problems by simply shifting the rows, which is a good way of doing it, putting 2 building lots on each of 4 sides and 1 in each of the corner. And that's the plan of Herrenhag just before its closing when 10 of the 12 lots have been built. And it's for this reason that the Levitical city was more permissive and a better model because it wasn't tied to the number 12. The Moravians divided each side into 3 in the reconstruction. An elegant solution, incidentally, that we find followed. Do any of you recognize this town? I think some of you are from it. That's New Haven, Connecticut, which, by the way, measures precisely 1,500 feet square, precisely the dimensions of the Levitical cities in Numbers 35. Not my discovery. That discovery was made by John Archer, my colleague. But that resemblance is not accidental. For the founder of New Haven, John Davenport, was part of the circle of German Protestant intellectuals who took refuge in exile in Amsterdam. And he even tried to recruit Comenius to teach at Yale. They all knew each other. It was a small world. And the theme of squareness and the right angle pervades the New Testament. We have it from John the Baptist. I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. We have it from Jesus himself. Straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, Matthew 7:14. So the corollary of this was that the way to damnation was correspondingly crooked, an image that an anonymous Pennsylvania German folk artist rendered with endearing literalness here. Straight path, the crooked path. But in each instance, the metaphorical meaning is clear. The Messiah is coming. We prepare for it by making straight those things that are crooked. This injunction was not to be taken literally as a program of highway improvement. No, although some millennial groups would do just that, the Shakers enforced on their members a thoroughgoing rectilinearity so severe that the footpaths of their town were made rigorously straight, permitting no diagonal shortcuts. When they danced, they assumed a formal geometry known as the square order. Even at dinner, we find their millennial laws. They were to cut the meat on their plates equal and square. For the Shakers, there was no meaningful distinction between righteousness and the right angles. The same is true, although in less exaggerated fashion, of the Moravians. This is 1752 map of their settlements in Silesia. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, They have little vignettes of 3 of their model towns, each an image of rectilinear perfection, and poised above them, emerging from a cloud, is the hand of God. I take it to be the hand of God. I see where the thumb is. It is the right hand of God bestowing divine approval on 3 square towns. By now, it should be clear that the city of Refuge had a distinctive physiognomy in its layout, but it also carried with it certain architectural consequences of the square. We've seen that a great many Baroque elements survive in the architecture of the Harmonists and also the Moravians. You'd have to expect this. The Baroque is the dominant generator of architectural ideas throughout the 17th and early 18th century. It was the style of the most prestigious, most authoritative buildings. And the principal architect of the Moravians, August Sigismund von Gersdorff, was himself a Saxon nobleman who based his buildings on the style of the Saxon court at Dresden. So wait, did I skip that? The Saxon court at Dresden, whose florid roofs, rhythmic plays of windows and dormers, the high drama of orchestrated volumes in space. We see all of those elements repeated of the Dresden Zwinger at Herrenhag. But while Herrenhag is Baroque, at the same time, it's not Baroque. It is not merely that its curves have been chastened and made straight, its sculpture eliminated. It lacks that one essential element of the Baroque experience, a climax. Every great Baroque ensemble from Versailles to the Piazza of St. Peter's aspires to a point of culmination toward which its orchestrated passages of movement converge. These culminating points were invariably towards some central locus of power, either a throne or an altar. And yet pure pietism knows no altars or thrones. And Herrenhag glorified no place of authority as the towns of absolutism invariably do. Say here is Palmanova, northern Italy, near Venice, with its central citadel. But while these lines converge and find rest at the point of power, the lines of Moravian buildings extend to Cartesian infinity without ever coming to rest. They ingeniously undercut any sense of hierarchical axiality by doubling elements, by pairing buildings, pairing doors, so that neither dominated. This was easy, of course, because men and women were seated separately for the Moravians, as for the Harmonists. There was another architectural consequence of this peculiar geometry. If the image of the town represented divine order, then the buildings where they gather is of secondary importance. It is the whole city and the people themselves which form the church. This explains why these Protestant cities could push the actual meeting house off to the side, down here. And this is the grandfather of all these gridded Protestant utopias. This is Albrecht Dürer's project for an ideal city in 1727, a city he imagined in fanatic, obsessive Germanic detail, a total of 1,073 separate buildings, and that's not counting the taverns, barbershops, bakeries, bread stalls, public fountains. These buildings accommodated 47 different trades or professions, from carpenters and goldsmiths to brewers and tent makers, and even to the lone bell ringer who had a little apartment right above the church down here. But look where the church is, dislodged to the eastern corner so as to leave the square open. It's not here where you'd expect it, it's over there. This displacement of the church is even more egregious at Freudenstadt, that refuge for Austrian silver miners. The church is pushed right to the corner, pushed so tight that it bends in order to maintain symmetry and is actually folded in half. Here, the men and women are not only seated separately, they're seated where they could barely see each other. don't think they were supposed to see each other. Only the minister, his pulpit in the elbow of the building, could see both halves. There's much more to the story, but I have to end here, and that's what my book is for. I want to leap ahead to the coda and give you the punchline, so we have a couple minutes to talk. By 1812, everybody in cultivated Europe knew about Father Rapp's experiment. In that year, a perceptive English traveler named John Mellish published his Travels in the United States. Widely distributed book, constantly reprinted. This is the first edition, which included a vivid, meticulously annotated account of his stay in Economy Village, giving the history of the Harmony Society of George Rapp, its beliefs, its customs, its economic structure, its distinctive mix of agriculture and industry, a narrative of the visit to Rapp's labyrinth, and a detailed description of the town of Harmony, not Economy. Town is regularly laid out. He gives you the dimensions, describes what the family is. It's worth reading. I mean, it is still the most succinct, lucid account of Harmony at the outset. This book made Father Rapp an international celebrity, and everybody commented on him, from Lord Byron to Friedrich Engels. Commented on him and imitated him. Robert Owen, the Welsh industrialist and social theorist, tried to adapt the Harmonist city of Refuge as a model for fighting the social disruptions of the Industrial Revolution. And Owen, reading this account, devised a secular version for Britain, and he would have peppered the whole English countryside with industrial cities of refuge, renamed villages of unity and mutual cooperation. And I show in the book that all this is taken virtually word from Mellish. Everything is there except God. So each of these is a gridded town with a population of about 1,000, which is pretty much what the population of Harmony is. The economy and finances are based on that of economy or of Harmony. So it was only natural 20 years later, when George Rapp sold, well, it was just 10 years later, when George Rapp sold his second town, that of New Harmony, Indiana, this is 1824, in order to finance the building of Economy, the only willing buyer anywhere was Robert Owen, who bought the town and set about transforming it into a kind of secular, but a glorious utopia. And it really would have been glorious had it been built, because Owen was scientifically literate, and his town was to have been run on the most up-to-date scientific principles. For example, there were 4 lofty ventilation shafts, from which, quote, all the smoke and vitiated air of the building is discharged into the atmosphere. Here they are puffing away. At the same time, on top of the ventilators were gas burners with reflecting lenses that would have lighted the town at night. Owen called them illuminators, and they would have been visible at night from a great distance, a beacon in the darkness, which is exactly what a utopia should be. And of course, it was a disaster. Owen was a prey to mountebanks, unskilled dreamers, all sorts of freeloaders. He filled it with writers and poets who wondered a couple days later why they were hungry. Within a few years, it collapsed. And although rather discrediting the idea of secular utopia, it only inspired a further torrent of imitators trying to create an earthly paradise, even into our lifetimes. Names might come to mind. Now, the fact that Rapp would sell his celibate utopia to a celebrated atheist champion of free love for Owen should strike you as more than weird. After all, Owen was notorious for having declared that religion makes man, quote, a weak, imbecile animal, a furious bigot and fanatic, or a miserable hypocrite. Yet there is a certain kinship in their thought, because both of them began in the world of textile manufacture before turning to the project of social reform, which they conducted with an uncompromising paternalistic will. And both of them, after trying for years to supervise an ordered community, had worked themselves into the exact same conclusion, that the chief obstacle to the creation of a perfect, radically new society was the traditional family unit. This was that which had to be swept away before a comprehensive new order could be installed. But at the same time, the abolition of alternative structures of authority could not help but enhance the power of these central leaders. They would not be the last utopian reformers who would come to this conclusion, as you well know. It's a strange fact about these communal societies that the more they sought to escape the world, the more the world was interested in them. The more they retreated, the more the world pursued. And this is why it seems to me that the history of the Harmony Society is not a footnote or a digression or a charming sideshow in the story of utopia, but in fact, it's a central strand in the biggest story of all, the history of our world. So that's my talk, and we have some time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. If anyone has any questions, please either unmute and you can talk, or you can put it in the chat.
I actually have a question, so I'll hop on real quick. Maybe I'll get people started. You finished with a comment a couple minutes ago about how they both, Owen and Rapp, came to the conclusion that the obstacle was the nuclear family. And I know here in New Harmony, they started with the community houses for the single men and women, but that didn't necessarily stop the building of kind of a single family home, either here or in economy. Do you think that he was trying to move towards that and he was pushed, or was he even trying to move towards that?
You know, Claire, I don't know as well about the New Harmony houses, but I do know the economy ones are not family houses. They're fictitious families, 3 women below, 3 men above. So it's in the 18 teens that he shocks them by saying one morning, by the way, we're celibate from now on, which was quite a shock. It's around that time so there are none of those community buildings at Harmony. That you're right, that's New Harmony. I think it was a progressive, gradual thing. I mean, the fact is I think I can say he was not a systematic theologian. He was constantly improvising new ideas. Almost like he reminds me in a funny way of Chairman Mao Zedong, constantly trying to maintain the revolutionary fervor of a society that's settling down. And the same thing happened to Owen at first. At first, Owen in New Lanark is trying to have idealistic schools and reform education, but then he becomes very bitter when he realizes these same children go home to their alcoholic mothers and fathers, and that's where the corruption occurs. So he thinks ahead. The only way to do it is to get the kids early and have them raised collectively, which is what he was hoped would have happened at New Harmony. Claire, good. Complicated issues. Everything is in motion. These are all moving targets.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else there?
Yes, we have a question from Andrea.
Yes.
Where does the building of squares in London or Dublin fall into the genealogy of squares he laid out here?
Yeah. You know, there's a lot of squares. That's I could have shown you the Monopoly board, which is all squares. It's the real estate dream to make a grid and sell parcels. And that goes way back to Roman colonial cities, which go way back to Greek colonial cities. And we're starting to find that the Egyptian workers were housed in gridded settlements. So that's the straightforward, rational way of dividing land. And it's the weird experience of the United States, which is like the ancient Greeks. We're a colonializing society that just pushes through to California, laying grids down. So we have that real estate division with Thomas Jefferson's rationalism, which grids the whole continent, over which is laid this other idea that New Haven is perfect divine order. So the two things coexist. But yeah, the London squares don't have this religious meaning.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Joe White.
I see your box is lighted up.
May or may not have used my edition published in 2003 of Mellish, but that's okay. All editions of Mellish are wonderful. However, my comments have to do with both your take on the spiritual, faith-based aspect of the Harmonist Society, which are very real, and the secular, non-faith-based career and progress and fascinating history of utopian societies. All right, starting with the faith-based bone I have to pick with you, frankly.
Pick the bone, please.
Okay, yes. Okay, you indeed got around finally to mention in passing the Harmonist belief in the second coming. Now, to my way of analyzing the Harmonists, and and my wife Delsa and I live in the Frederick Rapp House in Harmony. So, all right. Well, back to what I was going to say. Their belief, the Harmonist belief in the second coming, is unquestionable, and in addition to which, a belief in the second coming is extremely radical, as any believing Christian and any knowledgeable Christian, a scholar, whether a Christian or not, can tell you that the Book of Revelation is a pretty hard shoe for believers and non-believers alike. So I think you have to, so I think to strengthen your own case, you have to do more with their belief in the second coming. Okay, turning to the secular side of things, there can be no question at all but that the emergence of the Harmonist Society happened in an age of revolution. Okay, that not for nothing did the final decision on the part of Rapp and his followers that it was time to bail from Europe coincided with Napoleon. Okay, nor in addition to well, as if that wasn't enough, there was Owen himself, a creature of the Industrial Revolution, if ever there was the Industrial Revolution, if ever there was one. So much so that it seems to me that the way forward in Harmonist studies, one that is honored more in the breach than the observance, is to bring to bear the findings and methods of historians who don't study faith-based groups like the Harmonist Society to bear, to see what we could learn, and to discover that there's no accident, that there are key similarities between the Shakers and the Harmonists. Yeah, no getting around it. That there are key similarities between the benevolent Mr. Owen and the Harmonists, for all of their differences and suspicion and dislike of one another. Nevertheless, we know the story. Okay, so that finally we should take the full measure, particularly in our own troubled times, of the lack of small d democracy in the theory and practice of both secular utopianism and here our stand-in will be Robert Owen, and faith-based utopianism, for whom our point for which Exhibit A, of course, will be the Harmonist. Okay, well, the antidote to not enough democracy is to bring in a democracy, which in the case of the Harmonist Society is exactly what the Harmonists did immediately after the death of George Rapp. Okay, so that finally, for me to sum up, in addition to the unquestioned authoritarianism of 19th century utopianism, we note that that this did not go unchallenged by the rank and file, if you want to call them that, of the Harmonists, and that too has to be integrated into our story. Thanks for bearing with me for my long-winded speech.
Joe, that's great. You and I need to sit down for a long meal. There's so much. Next time I'm there, I'm gonna bring my Mellish for you to autograph for me. And but yeah, everything you say I agree with. It's
Right.
great.
Hey, that's what email's for.
That's right. Yeah.
I'll talk to you.
Good. See you.
Great.
I have another question here.
Yep.
A question about why they built with brick if they were expecting the second coming.
Built to last till Judgment Day.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I mean, they didn't expect it to be the next morning. They were Germans. Germans always build solidly. They're not consistent. I mean, Joe was kind of getting at that. Yeah, and brick, you're in Western Pennsylvania, they did build in stone. All the vaulting is beautifully cut stone. They're building with Germanic pride. Yeah, very proud craftsmen.
They followed the story of the three little pigs, I think.
Yeah, right.
Sarah, I'm going to have to pull that into when I do tours.
Sure.
Well, maybe that's enough, because I went on long. It's already after 8 o'clock. I'd be happy if anyone wants to email me with further questions, correspond. I'm at Williams College. You can find me.
I want to thank you once again for coming and talking to us at the Harmonist Connection with all three sites. It's been
My pleasure.
really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Go ahead. Just a reminder, this was recorded. I will hopefully have it up to the Harmonist Connection YouTube in the next week. We'll see how long it might take. But if you missed anything or want to share this program with others, please do so. And again, I echo Sarah. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. It was a very interesting program.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night, everyone.